So how are the causes of Indigenous homelessness rooted in the ongoing colonizing practices?
I mean, the best way I can answer that is to draw on some research I recently did in Calgary. I was hired by Horizon Housing, a nonprofit housing provider in Calgary, to look into the question as of why outcomes for their Indigenous tenants were not as favorable as outcomes for non-Indigenous tenants. Because what Horizon Housing was finding was that a very large percentage of their Indigenous tenants were not making it even a year in their housing. And this was very different than the results of non-Indigenous tenants. So they said, why? What's going on? So the first thing I formed an advisory committee with about 5 people, most of whom were Indigenous, to meet with me monthly to guide the research project. I also reached out to 15 Indigenous tenants at Horizon Housing and had one-on-one interviews with all of them. Then I talked to a whole lot of service providers. I talked to Indigenous knowledge keepers and elders. And what we found was that Indigenous tenants wanted to feel welcome from the get-go, and they weren't feeling welcome from the get-go. So they would get the keys to a new unit, and the orientation process consisted of about a 15-minute chat with the building manager. Here are your keys, sign this. Here are the exits. Enjoy and good luck. And we found that the orientation process for a new resident could be so much different. It could involve meeting with an elder. It could involve meeting with a frontline worker from the organization or from the housing provider. It could involve an intake process that involved asking the Indigenous tenant about what their needs are. It could involve the medicine wheel with the elder, figuring out a bit about the history of the person and what would make them have a more worthwhile tenancy at Horizon Housing. So we found out all those things, and it was a blind spot for the organization. They were really keen to find out what they could do differently, and they found out that there was a bit of a blind spot in the orientation process. We also found that Indigenous tenants had a strong desire for regularly occurring on-site cultural programming. They wanted elders brought in. They wanted to meet regularly with other Indigenous residents and non-Indigenous residents. And they wanted to talk about cultural issues. They wanted to smudge. They wanted to have a sharing circle. They wanted to do art together, Indigenous art. They wanted their histories and their uniqueness recognized, and they wanted to start working on this stuff as a collective. And they felt that this could really improve their experiences living at the buildings in question. Sadly, all this stuff costs money, and most providers don't. Most providers are stretched. So these kinds of improvements, like more on-site cultural programming and an on-site or an enhanced resident orientation process, they cost money, and they require partnerships with Indigenous organizations. So they're not always easy to do, but with the will and with the resources, they can be done. So this was eye-opening for me, and it's a public report, by the way. It's been published. It's available online. It was eye-opening to find out that the housing needs of Indigenous people were very different than the housing needs of non-Indigenous people.